And so if it's true that this phenomenon is simply part of a larger agenda, then we're left to wonder just how far they might go, to affirm the existence of aliens and also to control the narrative surrounding it. And to answer that question, you really don't need to look any further than the life of Paul Bennewitz in what must be one of the saddest stories to ever emerge from the world of ufology.
Paul Bennewitz, a self-made man, a very successful businessman, was systematically driven insane, wound up in an insane asylum, under treatment for a long time, lost his business, had to turn it over to his family, and was destroyed.
Paul Bennewitz was a highly respected electronics expert and a well-liked businessman who, by the late 1970s, had built a successful life in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was clearly a really intelligent guy, and he was an impressive engineer, as well as a bit of a UFO enthusiast. So when he began to notice strange lights in the skies near Kirtland Air Force Base, which happened to be close to his home, he decided to dig deeper. He started capturing pictures and videos of these mysterious lights and UFOs, building a large archive of physical evidence to support his sightings. And he even began to monitor this stuff with his own sophisticated radio equipment. And he was intercepting radio transmissions and attempting to decipher what he thought to be coded messages within the radio signals. And what began as curiosity would quickly spiral into a full-scale personal investigation. And before long, Bennewitz became convinced that he had successfully tapped into real communications between extraterrestrial spacecrafts and a secret alien base hidden in the nearby mountains. So Bennewitz did what any patriotic American might do. He took his findings to the U.S. Air Force. After all, this was a matter of national security, and that was the day when Paul Bennewitz became the unwitting target of a military psy-op that's so cruel and so unusual you wouldn't believe it if you didn't see it yourself.
I'm Richard Doty. There's probably about 80% of false information being presented, about 20% of factual information. Unfortunately, the UFO community doesn't know which is which.
And that's your job to keep it that way?
That was my job before. I'm a private citizen now, but back in the early 80s, it was my job to confuse the UFO community.
This is Richard Doty, an agent from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and he's the man who met with Bennewitz to review his footage and recordings. But if you were in charge of security at a military base and then some citizen were to approach you with boxes that were filled with photos and video recordings and even radio transmissions that were detailing top secret military tests, then you would understandably have some reasonable concerns. But rather than simply dismissing Bennewitz's wild claims or reassuring him that no alien activity existed, like, somebody might have expected him to do, Doty did the exact opposite. He confirmed Paul's suspicions, telling him that his theory was correct and that aliens truly do exist and there really is an alien base hidden nearby, and that the Air Force has been trying to investigate the situation, and Bennewitz just happened to stumble right into the middle of it all.
And it was very easy to convince Paul. Paul was a World War II veteran. He's very patriotic. He always flew his flag. Those type of people you can convince that, listen, just telling Paul, you can't tell anybody else about this because this, they could get in the wrong hands. And so immediately Paul became a cooperating source, and he held everything that he had gotten in secrecy.
But Doty wouldn't stop there. He actively fed Bennewitz fabricated information, forged documents, false leads, and made up stories about underground alien bases and government interactions with these extraterrestrials. The goal, according to Doty, was supposedly to divert Paul's attention away from any real Air Force operations by keeping him fixated on this fake alien narrative, which he already seemed to believe in the first place.
The Air Force actually put him in a helicopter with Rick Doty the first time and flew him up to a place above Dulce called the Archuleta Mesa. And before they took him up there, they dumped a bunch of props up there. They flew him up there, flew him over the mesa and said, "You're right, Paul, look, there's stuff here. There's some evidence of what's going on. Why don't you check this out for us?"
And that might seem reasonable at a glance, but if you think about it, it makes no sense at all. I mean, you'd think that if the United States Air Force needed to prevent some random citizen from recording sensitive information, it shouldn't be that difficult of an issue to resolve, you know? They could have politely accepted his evidence and just sent him on his way. They could have restricted his access to the area. You know, they could have even warned him under the guise of national security. But instead, Doty and his associates would go out of their way to convince Bennewitz that he truly was encountering extraterrestrial activities. They even went so far as to manipulate Bennewitz's radio equipment, causing it to register fake signals, and reinforcing his belief that he had tapped into alien communications. And whenever Paul came across something big, he always had Doty just a phone call away, and regularly stopping by to check up on his findings. And so, in the mind of Paul Bennewitz, Richard Doty was becoming a genuine friend. You know, it must have seemed like an incredible sign of trust and respect for a government agent like Richard Doty to openly share classified information with an ordinary citizen like himself. So I'm sure that from Paul's perspective, this gesture made him feel pretty important and special, you know, as if he was really on the trail of something significant, or at least something real. But in truth, Doty was no friend to Paul Bennewitz. He was actively manipulating him and feeding him lies and propaganda under the guise of a privileged friendship. It really all just seems like a cruel joke. You know, the stories that Doty told were just complete fiction, the materials that he shared were only fabrications, and even the mysterious radio transmissions were fake. And what Paul Bennewitz saw as a genuine friendship was, to Doty, nothing more than just another day at work. From that point, things only escalated. More agents became involved, and what began as a simple tactic of diversion and misdirection turned into a full-blown campaign of psychological warfare against the citizen Paul Bennewitz. White lies and doctored photos were now replaced with elaborate hoaxes, and at one point they even started to stage fake UFO sightings, and they were using these secret military aircraft, I'm sure the same ones that Paul had been filming, and they were orchestrating flyovers of Paul Bennewitz's home using helicopters that were disguised as flying saucers.
Oh, he says, you know, my real job is I'm in a special group in New Mexico. We've been doing something that is really interesting. He said, it just blows my mind. He said, we got these helicopters that I'm flying. He says, these helicopters are all fixed up. First of all, they got no markings on them. Second of all, they're really fast. Third, they're really quiet. And they got a lot of lights. We got red lights, we got white lights, we got strobe lights. I said, what are you talking about? He says, we pretend we're UFOs.
And although Paul managed to hold himself together for a while, the psychological toll on his mind would reach its breaking point when this fabricated alien narrative spiraled into what Paul Bennewitz perceived to be an imminent and inevitable alien invasion on the horizon. And from that point forward, his health and sanity would begin to quickly deteriorate as he devoted himself almost entirely to uncovering this truth. This truth, which was actually just a manipulation being fed to him, in particular by Richard Doty, his friend from the government. A fake friendship that was based on lies and deception, and one that would eventually break Paul Bennewitz. In 1988, having collapsed under the weight of the government's deliberate psychological assault against him, Bennewitz, the once highly respected electronics expert and well-liked businessman, was admitted into a psychiatric hospital.
So many people knew ultimately about Paul Bennewitz and that sad, strange, horrible story that it got way out of the realm of just a cute flying saucer story.
I think it goes without saying that this case is a terrible reflection of government corruption and the abuse of power. I mean, I think that much is pretty obvious. But it's also a case that raises some disturbing questions about the government's role in shaping the UFO narrative. And as far as that question of whether or not our government would be willing to stage a fake alien invasion for strategic purposes, I guess that this Paul Bennewitz tragedy proves that they would, and in fact have, already done just that. And of course, Bennewitz is just one account on the public record. I mean, who knows how many times this type of thing might have happened. And if they were willing to go to such great lengths just to deceive one man, what might that suggest about what they're telling the rest of us? This is William Moore, a prominent figure in the UFO research community during the late 1970s and 1980s, who was best known for co-authoring the Roswell incident, which is probably one of the most influential ufology books ever published, and which really popularized the idea of a major government cover-up surrounding this phenomenon. And Moore was well respected by his peers, and he was praised for his ability to gather information from the corridors of military intelligence, considered by many to be an authority on topics like government secrecy and disinformation. He earned a reputation for being able to connect with key figures in the government, building relationships with government insiders who were willing to leak concealed information to him under the guise of aliases and code names like Condor and Falcon. But more on that later. But anyways, he was a key figure behind the popularization of the controversial Majestic 12 documents, among other famous alien-related headlines. He made a lot of media appearances, and he was a frequent speaker at UFO conventions. But meanwhile, some ufologists were beginning to question if his ties to the intelligence community had ventured too far. And so after achieving great success with his groundbreaking book, The Roswell Incident, William Moore had become one of the most prominent names in ufology, advancing his reputation and creating opportunities to delve even deeper into the shady world of military intelligence and government secrecy. And eventually he was contacted by a special agent within the Air Force who claimed to have inside information on UFOs and classified military operations. A special agent by the familiar name of Richard Doty.
Probably Doty's first success in rounding up a useful asset, as they say in the intelligence field, or a useful idiot, as they also say in the intelligence field, was his recruitment of a man named William Moore. Now, William Moore, I think very significantly, was the co-author of the first book about Roswell.
I was given the task of making contact with Bill Moore and basically finding out what he knew and who he knew. Bill was a little reluctant to disclose everything to me. For obvious reasons, here I am, a government agent, coming in and introducing myself and wanting to know what he knew. But there's techniques that we use, that we're trained to use in gaining that person's confidence. And I used those techniques against Bill Moore, and they worked, and Bill Moore took me into his confidence, and we had a professional relationship as far as him providing us information about the UFO community and agreeing to say things that we wanted said regarding the UFO community or within the UFO community.
Now, at first, Moore saw Doty as a valuable contact, somebody who could provide him with access to valuable information and further his research. I mean, after all, this is exactly how Doty presented himself, as a man with a mutual interest in the topic who happens to possess archives of confidential evidence that prove the existence of aliens. And so I'm sure that Doty probably utilized the same approach and the same sales pitch that he used against Paul Bennewitz and likely others, assuring Bill that he was on the right track and offering him help in his quest for the truth. And once again, another well-intentioned researcher's life would quickly spiral into a web of deceit. Doty and his colleagues would get back up to their own tricks, and they started providing him with false information, and they were presenting it as top secret knowledge. And William Moore, eager for this insider access, unwittingly became a tool in their disinformation campaign. And to make matters worse, Bill Moore was a public figure with a lot of influence in the burgeoning field of ufology. And so as a result, he would go on to inadvertently disseminate many of these lies and disinformation that he was being fed throughout the UFO community at large. By the time that Agent Doty met William Moore, he was already engaged in his psy-op against Paul Bennewitz. And it wouldn't take very long before he would try to get Moore involved in the ordeal. Which is pretty crazy when you think about it, because here you have this prominent ufologist and self-described expert on the topic of a grand government cover-up, and you'd think that he would know better than to confide in a government secret agent, especially after being made aware of what was being done to Bennewitz. But Richard Doty is a professional liar, and somehow he managed to convince Bill Moore to join in his efforts, and in a selfish betrayal to a fellow UFO researcher and enthusiast, Bill Moore found himself drawn into this inhumane scheme against Bennewitz. And believing that he was inching closer to the real answers, Moore unwittingly became another one of Doty's shady associates, guilty of disseminating fabricated documents and false narratives to Paul Bennewitz, knowing all the while that it was pure disinformation. But eventually the truth would catch up to him. And in 1989, William Moore confessed that he had cooperated with government officials to mislead Paul Bennewitz in exchange for this access to classified information.
It became apparent to me that my supplying information to the government through Doty on the activities of Paul Bennewitz, APRO, and to a lesser extent several other individuals was to be a part of this equation. I also discovered that whatever it was that Bennewitz was involved with, he was the subject of considerable interest on the part of not one, but several government agencies, and that they were actively trying to defuse him by pumping as much disinformation through him as he could possibly absorb. Being a very small part of that process gave me, I thought, something of an advantage. It became my intention to play that advantage for all the information I could get out of it. Bennewitz, for his part.
Frankly, I'm a little ashamed of some people in this audience, regardless of what you believe, what you hear, or not.
They had to stop the talk about 4 or 5 times just because of all the yelling. People got mad, ran out of there. I saw a woman start crying and leave. People kept saying, "Where'd you get that crap from, Bill?" And one guy said, "I'm going to get a fire hose," and ran out the back. Very dramatic.
And this revelation really shocked the UFO community, who felt betrayed by Moore's complicity in this manipulation and mistreatment of a fellow researcher, Bennewitz. And it was an admission that ultimately destroyed his reputation, and also an incredibly ironic end to Bill Moore's story. Because here you got this prominent researcher, once known for debunking disinformation, who had himself now become a disinformation agent. And what he had hoped would have been his ticket to uncovering these hidden truths about UFOs turned into a career-ending scandal. Now, I do not have time to relay the stories of each investigator who has been compromised by their relationship with Richard Doty, let alone all the other special agents out there doing the same thing, but I can assure you that they exist. But today, you don't have to attend a MUFON conference to learn about them, because now they're being platformed on the evening news and on television shows, and they're doing podcast tours, and they're addressing Congress, They aren't conspiring against Paul Bennewitz anymore. Now they're talking right to you and me. And we've entered this time where our government now affirms the reality of UAPs, and our media is suddenly bombarding us with headlines about alien sightings and encounters all the time. But why should we believe them? Why should we expect them to be any more honest with us than they were with Bennewitz or with William Moore? For me, I'm led back to the questions that I opened up with. Could it be that this entire ET narrative is merely just a construct of government propaganda? Because judging from stories like these, it would seem that when it comes to researching this phenomenon, we have little to no way of distinguishing between what is true and what is counterintelligence, unless we experience it firsthand. But then again, if they're willing to fool Paul Bennewitz with helicopters disguised as flying saucers flying over his house, well, then perhaps even our own firsthand encounters can't be trusted. And really, the point that I'm trying to make here is that you and I are just as susceptible to deception as the 2 men that I just reported on. And if you think about it, the truth is that this UFO narrative has never been hidden from us. It's been fed to us.